It's been almost half a century since Peter Tosh sang. Now, as you may have heard, in much of the United States, it has been legalized.
And now to the growing acceptance of legalized marijuana across the country.
5 states legalized some form of it on Election Day.
In more parts of the U.S., weed is legal than it is not.
Like its customers, the market for legal cannabis keeps getting higher and higher. But there's a catch. While it is legal in many states, it is not legal federally. This is Lauren Thomas, General Counsel for Dutchie, a company that provides software to cannabis dispensaries.
We have to be aware of what federal enforcement priorities are to avoid being brought in on conspiracy or aiding and abetting charges.
So how can this be? How can something be legal in a state when the federal government says it's illegal?
I think a lot of people, they see, federal law makes it illegal, state law in some places make it legal. There should be a preemption issue there.
Jay Wexler is a legal scholar who teaches cannabis law at Boston University. And preemption is a legal doctrine that comes into play when a federal law conflicts with a state law.
Article 6 of the Constitution says that federal law is the supreme law of the land, which means that if you have the federal law and the state law and they conflict, and you can't do both at the same time, the state law falls away and the federal law is the one that governs.
But Wexler says that when it comes to cannabis, preemption is not the legal doctrine we should be paying attention to.
And that is because of this other quirky provision of the Constitution known as the 10th Amendment, which the Supreme Court has basically interpreted to say that the federal government cannot require states to do certain things or force them, or the legal doctrinal word that we use is commandeer the state.
This means that the federal government can't force states to arrest cannabis users and sellers who comply with their state laws. But they also can't block the federal government from enforcing its laws either.
They could send federal agents into every house all over America and just start arresting people for smoking weed. But federal government doesn't have those kinds of resources, and it doesn't have the will to do that.
But there once was a time when the federal government did have the will.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
In 1970, President Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act. The act divided a list of drugs into 5 categories, or schedules, based on their potential for abuse and medicinal value. Drugs in Schedule 1 were made illegal for all purposes.
Category 1 is the most dangerous drugs, and that's where marijuana is, like right next to heroin.
To justify this decision, President Nixon hired a group of doctors and legal experts known as the Schaefer Commission to study the dangers of marijuana. But when they found that marijuana was not as detrimental to health as assumed, Nixon ignored their report. Instead, he placed marijuana at the forefront of a war on drugs that would last decades.
The enforcement of these laws have absolutely disproportionately impacted communities of color and continue to do so to this day.
The federal government was uncompromising when it came to marijuana criminalization. But states were more like Peter Tosh. They saw things differently.
In the wake of the Schaefer report, which said marijuana is not really dangerous, a number of states, led by Oregon, decriminalized marijuana, which means if somebody's caught with marijuana or using small amounts of marijuana, they would have gotten a traffic ticket kind of thing, like a civil infraction.
California led the way to legalizing medical marijuana in 1996. And Colorado and Washington were the first to legalize recreational marijuana use in 2012.
State law is only preempted by the CSA if it is physically impossible to comply with both state and federal law. States, knowing this, have carefully crafted their medical and recreational marijuana laws.
With their carefully crafted laws and the 10th Amendment on their side, remember what Professor Wexler said about commandeering the state? States were able to legalize marijuana and avoid federal preemption.
When people hear, preemption is not a problem, they might think, okay, so then the federal government's not really important when it comes to state marijuana businesses or state marijuana use. And that's not true, because lots of our daily activities and the activities of businesses are regulated by federal law.
Because most banks are federally licensed, they are very hesitant to support even non-touching businesses like Dutchie's because they don't know when federal enforcement could prevent them from continuing to service the industry.
Without access to banks, cannabis companies operate largely on cash and are unable to access basic financial services such as loans. And then there are taxes.
The federal tax code has a provision 280E, which say 280E to any marijuana lawyer or any marijuana business person, and they go, I hate that thing, right? Because what 280E does is it says that drug traffickers, which includes, for federal law purposes, marijuana businesses, cannot deduct the ordinary business expenses that a typical business can deduct.
This includes salaries, rent, software costs. They can only deduct the costs of goods sold.
Banking and tax are maybe the biggest issues, but there are all sorts of other areas which are important too. Cannabis companies cannot take advantage of federal bankruptcy law if they go bankrupt, which many of them do. The U.S. Patent and Trademark Office will not grant trademarks to companies that are doing illegal things.
Most technology businesses rely a lot on H-1B visas to bring in incredible engineering and technical talent from around the world. From the federal government perspective, coming to the states to work on cannabis is the same as coming to the states to sell heroin.
Despite the complex matrix of laws under which cannabis has been legalized, the industry continues to grow. And there are some signs that things may eventually change at the federal level, including a push to allow cannabis companies to access banking services and to be taxed like other businesses.
A $17 billion industry that doesn't have access to financial services. It's an invitation to money laundering, to theft, to tax evasion.
In addition, a lot of federal legislation is aimed at providing more support for people of color, potentially requiring states to reconsider the convictions or expunge the records of people who had previously been convicted of marijuana-related crimes. I think that's an essential part of the restorative justice that needs to take place.
Eventually, the federal government will stop this craziness and will take marijuana out of Schedule 1.
And maybe, just maybe, a plea from a 1976 reggae song will finally be met.